Thanks, everyone. So very welcome to the sixth and the last public lecture of our freebies public lecture series on the state of the art of basic income policy research. So as I've explained, many of you have heard this 100 times now, or at least 6 times at least. This is part of, freebies public lecture series, but also part of a master's course in which myself and students then digest and process and criticize the paper in more depth in a separate session. But the public lectures, of course, are free, and everyone actually who attended 6 of them, you can buy yourself a big piece of cake to celebrate. You've done very well. But also the people who kind of pop in just for the one, you're very welcome, right? So the way we'll run this, as before, Leire, the speaker today, will talk for about half an hour, focused on an article, but also, I think, linking it to some of the related research she's done. And then we have sort of 25 minutes, 30 minutes for question and answers, okay? So it's my absolute pleasure today to welcome Leire Rincón as the speaker of today. So Leire did her PhD like a few years ago only, really, but in the meantime has actually managed to put herself, she basically has become pretty much the leading expert on a very specific methodology, conjoint experiments, and applied that to basic income. So you'll hear all about it in the presentation, of course. So Leire, last year, I think, was actually in Germany, was a postdoc at the Humboldt University in Berlin, but now is back in Barcelona, which is the home base for her at the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona. So she's an expert in, welfare state research, welfare state policy, but especially with a focus on public support and how that links to sort of political economy issues, which of course links directly to the previous speaker we had only 2 days ago, who also was a co-author of her at some point. And as I mentioned before, the one big thing that she's really an expert on is this conjoint experiment. So that's really this very innovative approach. And without further ado, Leire, I'm going to give you the floor for 30 minutes.
Okay, so thank you very much, Jürgen, for your very kind introduction. I'm sharing my screen. Can you see the slides correctly?
We see everything fine.
Great. Okay. So thank you again for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. So today, what I will be presenting is actually the first paper that came out of my doctoral thesis a couple of years ago, where I was trying to understand what is it about basic income in terms of the policy design that attracts individuals or maybe more contentious. So really understand the puzzle that was motivating my research, we need to go back some years. 2017, when what we had on basic income, and especially the data on public opinion and public support on basic income, was developed from surveys like this European Social Survey, in which respondents were asked to give a rate of support towards a particular definition of basic income. Well, this definition was very comprehensive, and we managed to understand which characteristics of individuals made it more or less likely to support this policy. What we could not know or find out from this question is, what is it about a basic income that people like or dislike? Of course, this is because the definitions include a broad range of features, like the fact that it's for everyone, so it's universal, the fact that it covers essential living costs, but it's unconditional as well, how it's paid for, and what occurs with other benefits. So we're really, by asking respondents these sort of questions, we really don't understand what they're thinking about when they're giving a rate of support. This opens a series of questions. Sort of the first broader and more intuitive question is, what is it about a universal basic income that really generates support or opposition? And specifically, what is it about the features of a universal basic income that generates this support rate. The second question would be, how does then this support compare to other policy alternatives on the table? So, and what we mean by this is, what are we observing with this support? So is this support reflecting simply a sort of underlying demand for more government intervention and more redistribution, or is it really indicating a preference, a genuine preference for this form of policy, for universal basic income? So these are the key questions that were leading my research at the time. So to really sort of guide the research, I departed from this idea that, of course, was not new, but the fact that universal basic income is a very distinctive policy proposal to any other cash transfer and that we have available now, or any other sort of welfare provision. So of course, we all know very well the definition of a basic income, but the key thing here to remember is that universal basic income has two particular features that make it a very distinctive policy proposal. So the fact that it's universal, that is for everyone, that is not for any specific population subgroup, and the fact that it's unconditional, so it doesn't come with any strings attached or any behavioral requirements or fulfillment criteria. This particular combination makes it really stand out and be a great contrast to any other welfare policy proposal and any form of orthodox welfare provision. So it is these two attributes that we really need to understand. By this distinctiveness, the existing work at the time that predicted or wanted to explain support for basic income usually developed theories based on the traditional welfare preference theories. These are theories that typically explain support for different policy proposals based on the characteristics of the individuals themselves rather than the policies. And these theories typically predict that if particular policies are in the material self-interest of public opinion, that is, if particular individuals win from this policy proposal, then they're more likely to give support, but also ideological predispositions may also explain this support. The problem of applying these theories to support for universal basic income is that UBI is very different to any other form of welfare. First, it violates all of the deservingness criteria of recipients because it's for everyone. So recipients essentially do not have a predetermined deservingness. And secondly, the redistributive appeal of a UBI is really not intuitive, because with targeted schemes, it's really intuitive to understand that if a population subgroup that doesn't have, or that is low income or below the poverty line receives a cash transfer, this ideally this group will be better off. With the UBI, this is not intuitive at all. And to really understand the redistributive potential of a UBI, one needs to understand more complex topics and issues like unemployment traps and poverty traps, which is maybe too demanding to ask for public opinion. So for these reasons, the argument in this paper, it's actually that UBI's core characteristic of universality and unconditionality, especially when combined, is what will be reducing to support towards this policy proposal. And precisely because the redistributive appeal is not clear and because it violates all these deservingness criteria. So this argument of deservingness is not new. We've had a lot of literature that explains also which sort of deservingness criteria is more important than others. But the key thing, so kind of some of the novel arguments that I brought to the basic income literature was why is it that deservingness is so important in decision making or in support for different policies? And to argue this, I draw on political psychology and evolutionary psychology literature, which actually the arguments proposed by this scholarship is that Human beings have a series of heuristics or sort of informational shortcuts that they use to make decisions in different aspects of life. One of them is which welfare policies to support. And because for a long time giving to those who really needed to be helped or who would be reciprocal determined human species survival, today these heuristics are still well, have been embedded over time and are still a big part of this decision making. Of course, when it comes to universal basic income, this violates this deservingness heuristic. So it's sort of even an unconscious automatic process of supporting different policies. So essentially here, the prediction is that it is both UBI's unconditionality and universality features would be detracting public opinion from supporting this policy. But what I also argue is that maybe under particular circumstances, we can boost support for these features, especially for universality. And this would be if we impose stricter conditions to ensure recipients' deservingness, and also if we ensure that existing welfare provision is maintained. So sort of to test this hypothesis, I used an original survey design, which included a conjoint experiment, which I will explain in more detail now. And it was administered online to a representative sample of the Spanish population. So now to the conjoint experiment. Conjoint experiments are essentially specific experimental tools that are very suited to break down apparently unidimensional choices into its component parts. So they break down, in this case, policy packages to its sort of component parts to be able to disentangle which aspects of the policy are more or less attractive to different individuals. And actually this sort of conjoint experiment has been used before, was used before by other welfare state research. So just to give a more visual example of some ice creams, what conjoint experiments do is that they make respondents choose between different alternatives, like the ones that we're seeing on the screen now. By making respondents choose, they're able to understand which sort of dimensions, so whether it is the brand, the flavor, or the price that is more important to respondents, and then what are the ideal combinations. So maybe the ideal combinations is the lowest price and vanilla flavor. So this is what conjoint experiments do, and they do so by simply providing tasks to respondents that they in which they have to choose their preferred options. Actually, this is a very relevant example because conjoint experiments were developed in the field of marketing research, and then later, well, years later, they were brought into political science. So this is the experimental design, the conjoint experimental design that was developed to measure support for universal basic income. So what we did was to define a series of dimensions that would say are the core characteristics that are shared by most welfare cash transfers. So that is target groups. Every cash transfer has a different target group. So some cash transfers go to specific populations of groups who are under the poverty threshold, or maybe with family or with children under care, or with dependent family members. In the case of universal basic income, there would be no target group, so it would be for everyone. Cash transfers also typically have some form of behavioral conditionalities. So for instance, either being unable to work or looking for employment, maybe having part-time employment, and so on. They also have a specific quantity. They have a unit of recipients. So we find that most cash transfers are either given on the individual basis or the household basis. They have specific legal requirements. So whether they are for the whole So for residents, or you have to be a citizen to receive this this policy, and of course they're funded through specific funding mechanisms. So this was the core sort of design of the conjoint experiment. We randomized the appearance of the different attributes within two different policy proposals. And respondents typically saw this conjoint task, in which they had to read the two policy proposals, and they had to rate each one of them. So from 0 to 10, they had to rate how much they liked each proposal, and then they had to choose the proposal they preferred. This means that we then have two measures or two dependent variables. One is a forced choice, so the preferred policy proposal, and the other one is the support rate. What I will show you today, and what I typically use, although it's not always the case in my research, is the support rate, because I believe this is much more indicative of the extent to which the different proposals are more liked or disliked. So when you have a forced choice, you just have the preferred policy proposal, but you don't really know how much individuals like or dislike this policy proposal. So there are typically also two quantities of interest to measure support, to measure sort of the effect of the policy design on support rates. I will not go into this, but if anyone has any questions, I could tackle them at the end. The essential difference between these two quantities is whether they have sort of a baseline of comparison or not. So the average marginal component effect would be the marginal effect of one particular attribute. Let's say that a cash transfer is universal, average over the other distribution of the attributes within one dimension. So it would be the probability of choosing one particular attribute within one particular dimension, always compared to one other attribute within that dimension. So we always have a baseline of comparison. With the marginal means, we do not have this baseline of comparison. So it's much more indicative of the support rate in general. So moving to the results. These are the general effects. So these are the main results, so the main marginal means of the support rate dependent variable of this conjoint design, in which we're trying to measure support for universal basic income. So the first dimension, which is the target group or the sort of the population subgroup, seems one of the most contentious dimensions, because it's where we find more different effects. So in this case, there is a high rate of support for cash transfers that are given to those population subgroups who are under the poverty threshold, as compared to universal cash transfers in line with the UBI. And this is significantly different. So it means that in this sense, one of the contentious features of a UBI is precisely its universality. We do not find this so much with unconditionality, because actually, moving to the next dimension of conditions, the overall, so the support for unconditionality is not significantly different from other possible types of conditions. So it is not the case, or we do not find that it is the case in Spain, that it is precisely the unconditionality of universal basic income that makes it problematic. It's also not the case for the units of recipients. People there's no strong significantly different effect of giving to individuals or households. We find that in terms of quantities, what we call the euro dividend, which was a proposal to give 200 euros to every individual, is not that popular. This may be because it may be perceived as a very low quantity. And we also find that legal requirements are not especially important. There are no strong significant differences. The funding mechanisms, however, are probably one of the most contentious and defining dimensions. So essentially what we find here in terms of the substantive preferences is that individuals give or prefer policies which are funded by progressive taxes, so increasing personal income taxes to those with the highest incomes, and are very much retracted by funding any form of cash transfer, by reducing the existing welfare, increasing taxes to everyone, or increasing the inheritance tax. Actually, this has been, inheritance taxation has been a very heated debate in Spain, and it's quite an unpopular tax here. So all in all, what we see from this initial graph is that it is UBI's universality that is particularly a contentious and unpopular feature. So the next question would be, under which conditions can we increase support for this universality feature? And there were several possibilities over the table. The first one would be that by increasing conditionality, so looking at the bottom left graph in this slide, by increasing conditionality, we could increase support for universality. We find that this is not the case at all. If we add any form of behavioral conditions, the support for universality stays the same, more or less. With legal requirements, we find this time that giving to or focusing on citizens rather than residents may increase support, or at least gathers a higher support rate for this feature of universality. And finally, we find that the same general effects of increasing personal income tax to the highest incomes also increases. So this form of funding mechanism also increases support for universality. And this is in fact the finding of why this paper is called a Robin Hood for all. Because what we find is that, and I will explain how we can see this in this graph in a minute, but what we find is that giving to those in need, which was a very general policy proposal in Spain, or a policy characteristic, is as popular as universality if both are funded through increasing the taxes of the highest incomes. And we can see this here. So the first funding options are the funding options when we give to populations of groups in need, so with low incomes under the poverty threshold. And the second set of funding mechanisms next to universality are the same funding mechanisms, but when giving to everyone. So in the line with the universal basic income. What we observe is that, we can see this more clearly here, the support rate is almost the same. So it's actually statistically the same for giving to those in need than for giving to everyone, in line with the universal basic income, when we fund it through increasing taxes to the highest incomes. And this finding is what gives the name to the paper. So essentially, let me see how we're doing with time. Universality, or what we find is that, at least in the case of Spain, universality is one of the most contentious features. Individuals prefer to give to those in need, to those with low incomes under the poverty threshold, rather than to everyone. But unconditionality is not a contentious feature. And in fact, increasing conditions, behavioral conditions, will not increase support for universality. What we find is that actually increasing personal income taxes to the highest incomes to fund this sort of more universal policy package would increase support for universal basic income. So this first paper already opened up a series of questions. One first question would be, what is the mechanism behind this increased support for universality when it's funded through progressive taxation? So this Robin Hood effect. Why is it the case that individuals give almost the same degree of support. One of the potential answers or hypotheses that we could develop is maybe because it's perceived as more redistributive. If it's funded by progressive taxation, maybe individuals perceive it as more redistributive. The other question would be, do these findings travel to other contexts, or is this something specific of Spain, or of the specific welfare context, or the debate on UBI? And the third question would be, what are the heterogeneous effects? So what are the effects that we find across income groups and ideological groups in terms of support for these different features? So these, I think, would be sort of the key future questions to address, some of which have been partially addressed and some of which not so much. So some of these, so to the extent to which findings travel to other contexts is something that we've explored with some co-authors, Tim Blandas, who was here a few days ago. And actually, we find that no, these findings do not exactly travel to other contexts. In Finland, we find that actually the target group or is not a particular contentious dimension. So it is not the case that universality is particularly unpopular. Unconditionality, or the conditions given here, is more is more contentious. And what we find actually in terms of gathering support for universality in Finland is the opposite that we find in Spain. So in Spain, we found that with progressive taxation, support for universality increased. In Finland, we find that actually if we increase personal income taxes to everyone, this attribute of universality becomes more popular. And we can see this here in the graph. So if we give to those in need, increasing personal income taxes to the highest incomes increases support for this feature. So this would be showing the typical Robin Hood policy of taking from those who have the most and giving to those in need. But support for universality increases or is higher when actually we increase taxes to everyone. So when everyone chips in to pay for this cash transfer. And then in terms of heterogeneous effects, so that is, and then I will stop here. So we wanted to address this question of, if conventional UBI research has always predicted or has always shown that particular subgroups like the low incomes, the left wing, tend to support a UBI, what is this support showing? So is this support showing an actual preference for UBI or simply an underlying demand for more government intervention? So this is something that we can observe with heterogeneous effects. These are heterogeneous effects from this same conjoint design across ideological groups. What we find is that those on the left indeed support more, give significantly higher rates of support to universality and unconditionality, which are UBI's core features. So the two attributes that we have in the middle of the graph. Still, they do not prefer this form of intervention because they significantly give higher rates of support towards the contending policy form, which is targeting, and slightly more support towards conditionality. So what we find is that even, and these are just some preliminary findings, but even our core coalition of supporters, even if they give more support to a UBI than other ideological counterparts, they still prefer other forms of government intervention that are not a UBI. So some of the remaining questions from all of these findings are, what is the role of context in really shaping these different preferences? Because we find different dimensions configure support differently in different contexts. And what then, if it's not ideology, if it's not income that drives an actual preference for UBI, what is really driving an actual preference for UBI and not just mere higher support? So I will leave it here, and I will be very happy to address your questions and discuss more broadly the research on UBI with you.
Okay, thanks very much, Leire. This has been fascinating, entirely as expected, and I very much appreciate you bringing in some of the other research in a way to sort of address the questions that were left on this paper.